Welcome, everybody, to Brian Roberts Inspired. I am your host, Brian Roberts. I'm both humbled and honored to have with me today John O'Leary. John is the #1 national bestseller and author of the book On Fire. He also has a new book, In Awe. He's a world-class inspirational speaker, inspiring crowds of 20,000 plus. He is the host of Live Inspired podcast. John, you've moved me to tears, brother, and emotions through your story and through your work. Thank you for saying yes, by the way, today, and joining me with Brian Roberts Inspired podcast. Welcome, my friend.
Hey, Brian, this is cool. Congratulations. I'm about 350 episodes in front of you. So I have my own podcast, as you mentioned. And my first guest was not some astronaut or author or president. My very first guest was my mom. And so when you talk about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, I'm honored to be considered someone doing extraordinary things, but I do recognize how ordinary I am. And I mean that. So I'm grateful for the opportunity and looking forward to the conversation.
Well, I appreciate that. It's been amazing, John, to step back and really watch your career take off. You know, I remember 15 years ago, if you recall, I hired you to come in and speak to a very small group of our clients and prospects. And when I say hire, that sounds real formal and fancy. I probably paid you with high fives and hugs or a cup of coffee. But man, just to watch you and see what you've done with your career, little did I know that a friendship would emerge out of that. Little did I know that I too would be engulfed in the story of John O'Leary and who you've become. So it's so cool to be full circle and sitting with you here today. And I'm just excited to jump in and really get to know what you're doing these days. I'm super excited for you.
Well, dude, the journey began right before your organization with a group of 3 Girl Scouts. And so my first massive motivational speech ever delivered around the world was in our own backyard here in St. Louis in front of 3 third graders. No Girl Scout cookies were given, no Samoas, no pats on the back, no high fives. And so the fact that you at least gave me a couple fist bumps and high fives and hugs, you overpaid, I think, for the services that were rendered. So we both grew up a little bit since those days. And it's cool to recognize that in the end, love wins. And that sounds so trite. But if you just serve well, and if you want to get better every single day, whether it's in podcasting or as a dad or a mom or an aunt or an uncle or as an advisor, whatever the role is, if your goal is ultimately to make the other person better, what always happens is not only do they get better, but so do you.
I think that's incredible. Serve well. You know, all too often, especially the world that we live in today, I think servant leadership is lost on folks. So it's empowering to hear you describe that. I know that that's the ethos of John O'Leary and who you are and what you do. I know you have an amazing book out, In Awe. But before we dive into that, if I may, could we go back to the beginning of your story? Could we go and have you share with our listeners how your life was changed forever as a young, innocent 9-year-old boy, and how you chose to purposely move through life to inspire folks because of that?
Yeah, and it's ironic because in part it changed when I was like 27, when my mom and dad wrote a book about the question you're asking. Because Brian, before they wrote the book, their little book, their biography of their son's tragedy and then triumph, I never talked about it. Like, why would you talk about something tragic? It's horrible. It's sad. You lost your fingers. You got scars. Oh, what a horrible story. And then I read it from their perspective and for the first time recognized the profound blessing of this story that for 2 decades I'd ignored and hidden from intentionally. So the story is at age 9, I was involved in a gasoline explosion in my parents' garage. About a week before the explosion, I witnessed boys in my neighborhood playing with fire and gasoline. Kind of common behavior for little boys. And I assumed if they can do it, that I could as well. So I tried. And the result was this 5-gallon can of gasoline splitting in 2 and launching me 20 feet against the far side of the garage, setting me on fire, setting the garage on fire, covering all of these things with gasoline and changing not only my world, but like our collective family's world. I've learned in time that what happens to one, it never happens in a vacuum. It has a collective collateral damage. And so I was eventually rushed to the hospital and had burns on 100% of my body. 87% of those burns are 3rd degree. And one more nugget I'll throw out there before you ask a follow-up. The way in 2021 they do the math around patients' perspective and chances of living through fire is they take the age. So do the math at home. This is going to be very complicated. 9 write down the percentage of the body burned. Now you write down the number 100, and you've got mortality rate. So in 2021, this child has 109% likelihood of passing away from these burns. And this is 1987. So there's no chance. And yet here we are, two ordinary guys trying to do extraordinary things through grace and love, and a whole lot of people showing up for me.
I think I remember hearing this story, seeing this story multiple times. I too have my 9-year-old boy sitting front row to hear you describe this story. And I think the thing that stuck out for him and for me was just the intensity, right? And the graphic pictures of what happened to you in that moment. Can you describe what was going through your mind, the pain, going to the hospital? I remember you vividly talking about, oh my gosh, my father's going to kill me. He's going to kill me because this just happened. Can you take us back to that moment?
Yeah, of course. I never talk about the ride to the hospital, but I remember it vividly, man. Like, it's a very vivid memory for me. And as a 9-year-old Missouri kid, I'd really never been away from home. And I'd probably never been with strangers, like teachers on day one of school, but then they're your teacher and they're your friend and you're surrounded by friends. So here I am now, leaving the house in the back of an ambulance by myself, watching the home burn. Can you imagine watching your house burn because of something you did, and looking down at my body and seeing everything just ravaged and drained from me, and looking up at this guy that I'd never met before. And he's telling me that everything's going to be all right. And then he's asking like, hey, John, where does it hurt? And I'm like, man, it hurts everywhere. And what I also remember though is like his compassion. So EMT or paramedic, maybe a fire, whatever his role was. Like, even as a child, I experienced compassion from this guy who I met about 7 months later when we came out of the hospital, and the news was they're celebrating the firefighters that showed up for us that day. But eventually those guys take me to the hospital. I'm in the room, they're checking on me, they're trying to tend to me, but there's not much in the very early moments they can do for me. And then I hear my dad's voice down the hall. And it's the first familiar thing I'd heard in the last, hour. And so I'm hearing beeps and I'm hearing hushed whispers of nurses talking about how he probably won't make it and all this other stuff happening around me. But then I hear my dad say, where's my son, John? And when I heard the question, there was this aura of like familiarity and comfort. But at the same time, when I heard his voice, I knew he was going to be furious, because I burnt down his house. I caused all kind of damage to family members and to our belongings and to myself. And so I knew his wrath was coming. I got in trouble for far less than burning down Dad's house growing up, so I knew that the shoe was going to drop, man. Yeah. And he walks in and he comes over to me, he looks down and he says, John, look at me. So I look up at age 9, like your little boy Brock was at the time. And then he goes, I have never been so proud of anybody in my entire life. And my little buddy today, this morning, I am just proud. I'm just proud to be your dad. I love you. I love you. John, look at me. I love you. And, just that day, the first thing I thought when he said that is, the old man doesn't know. No one told my dad I burnt down the freaking house, man. So that was the first thought. But what became clear over time was he did know, and he didn't care. And so often in life, we get so focused on the stuff, the minutia that does not matter. Our eyes are trained to the stuff that is fading and fleeting and wildly unimportant. That day, my dad left work, took the call, rushed by the house, saw the thing burning, could not have cared less about his home, cared deeply about his 5 kids who were there, ushered them to a neighbor's house, ran to the hospital, runs in, sees any parent's worst nightmare, a 9-year-old with no skin dying. And my dad just breathed out the fear. And you talked earlier about, I think, like intentional movement, just moved into that fear with faith and joy and love and grace. He changed and I caught. And the reason I'm so optimistic in the midst of 2021, when everyone else is so worried about the future, is the future's changed one person at a time. And I don't really care all that much about what happens in Springfield or Jeff City or DC. I know, like, John, how dare you say that? I don't really care. I think we should care a lot less about the White House and a lot more about our own house and our ability to influence things around us. And if we do that, and if we do it well, and if we start scaling that change, it doesn't really matter what happens in these other places. The change we seek happens in our own backyard first. My dad modeled that. It changed both of us. Then it changed the entire staff at this hospital.
That's incredible. I think, let's unpack that for a second. You mentioned, we were discussing earlier, just impacting one person, right? And I think purposeful movement is so imperative right now. I mean, if we look at all the noise, we've got all the things that are happening in our lives, look at our children and all the things that they're being pulled to with social media and other instruments, knocking them off course. And if we can make that one intentional impact with somebody, purposely move somebody forward, that's part of what's inspiring about this conversation with you and really launching this and running down that path. I think if that one person hears the message, we just impacted and made it better. And I think that's incredible what you're doing. Let me ask you this. One thing that stuck out with me being a St. Louis fan was how Jack Buck was so inspirational, and talk about purposeful movement with you and how he was able to help you. Can you describe that for our listeners and really take us back to that moment of how impactful that man was in your life?
And honestly, in the amount of time we have, the answer to your question is no, I can't, because words don't really do it justice. I was talking to a dear friend last night. We had a drive from Nashville back up to St. Louis. We had several meetings, socially distanced down to Nashville, and then did a couple of recordings in some theaters down there, and then drove back home late last night. And we were just talking about influences in our life that changed us. And he talked about his grandparents. I talked about my parents. He talked about one of his teachers. And then I talked about Jack Buck. So we carried ourselves through 5 hours of this late night driving, talking about people who positively influenced our life for the good. And for me, one of them was a guy named Jack. And I recognize, Brian, some of your listeners may not know that name. They may not be from our community, or they may be a little bit younger than you and I. And so Jack Buck was the broadcaster for the Cardinals in the late 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, and until 2002 when he passed away. And he was my hero. Anyone who grew up within reach of 1120 KMOX, Jack Buck was your guy, because he was bringing into living color the St. Louis Cardinals during a time when you weren't watching live very frequently, or on the internet ever, or on TV frequently. So Jack was the guy. And I got burned on a Saturday in January. And the following day, I'm tied down into a hospital bed. Can't move my arms or my legs. My eyes are swollen shut. And I got a trach, which means I can't breathe. I also can't eat or drink, and I can't talk. So I'm completely cut off from the world. But I could dream and hope and pray, and I could listen. Whose voice besides maybe your mom and dad's would you rather hear in this community than Jack Buck's? And he comes into my world that day for the first time. I'd never met him live before that day. He had been told by a family member that a little boy was going to die. And rather than just say, oh, it's too bad, the following day he shows up in a stranger's life, walks into the scary room. A burn center is a difficult place to visit, sits down next to me, a stranger, and says, "Kid, wake up. You are going to live. You are going to survive. Keep fighting. John O'Leary Day at the ballpark will make it all worthwhile. See you soon." And then he leaves. He's told by the staff that there's no chance. And you talked a moment ago about purposeful action, purposeful movement. The following day, even though he's told previously that the kid's not going to survive, and now by the staff, in quotes, the experts, that the little boy's not going to survive, the following day, into that headwind, he shows back up into a stranger's life, walks back into the darkness and says, "Kid, wake up. You are going to live. You're going to survive. Keep fighting." And Brian, if the story ends there, it's like, wow, what a guy. But he comes back the following day and the following day and the following day for the 5 months I'm in hospital, and lives into the promise of John O'Leary Day at the ballpark. It's one thing to say, "Hey, Brian, we should get together sometime." And then 11 years later, it's like, yeah, we should get together sometime. And you never do the things you say you're going to do. That's so common in our lives because we're busy, and also we're really important. We're just all really busy, important people.
So true.
So is Jack. Okay, like I want to make sure he's not retired. He's not bored. He's highly busy, but also highly focused on what matters. And so again and again over 5 months, he keeps visiting me. And then we have, I think the date is July 26th, against the Pittsburgh Pirates. We have John O'Leary Day at the ballpark, this celebration of victory, not individual victory, collective victory.
Wow. I mean, you hear so oftentimes the bad stories with celebrities or people in the spotlight. I think hearing stories like that with prominent figures in the community that are held out at higher standards, it's amazing to me, that story and how he impacted you and had John O'Leary Day at the ballpark. I mean, what it's a kid's dream to do that.
It is, and it was. And one more thing I'll layer into that is, and he, for some reason, did not even post on it on Instagram or Facebook. He did not tweet out, "Look at me." You know, I mean, most celebrities are doing a lot of good work, and the very first person you see in the great work they're doing is themselves. Jack didn't talk about it. He didn't write about it. There's 2 autobiographies he wrote. In one of them, he whispers out, there's a kid as gutsy as anybody I've ever met named John O'Leary. I was lucky to do some good with him. That's what he says. He doesn't talk about the visits. He doesn't talk about the baseballs. He doesn't talk about the decade and a half of mentorship. He almost talks about like, wow, aren't I lucky to have been blessed to be part of John's life? So he refuses to take credit and refused to brag about it when he was doing it. So it's just so countercultural and so attractive.
That's amazing. What a servant leader. That is true inspiration. I know you have many heroes along the way through your story that have been impactful in your life. And reading your new book, In Awe, you know, I had always heard the story that you have shared, bits and pieces about, you know, playing the piano, right, with amputated fingers. And that in and of itself is inspirational. But when you talk about Miss Bartello, right, and your mother moving you away from the table to the piano in your home, and what you had to endure and how strong she was, how consistent she was every Tuesday for 5 years in your life. Can you please share with us that story and then the crescendo of that when you ended up performing at the end? I would love for you to share that story.
Yeah. So what a great story. You know, sometimes I hope for all of your listeners and for you and me, you look back at your life and you're almost like, I can't believe that's part of my story. And I can't believe I married her. I can't believe I got in that school. I can't believe I got that job. I can't believe he said I do. I can't believe we had this child. Like, I can't believe we got to go skiing. I hope as you look back at your life, you're not only seeing what's wrong and out of place, because the media and social media does a phenomenal job of reminding you what's wrong and what's out of place and how you do not stack up. But you have the ability then to choose what matters and how you do want to recall your life and what matters and the blessings that you had and still have, and I believe we'll have going forward. So I look back at my life and these stories you're asking me about, like, dang, dude, I can't believe that I'm part of this. Not the hero. I don't wear the cape. I'm like the recipient of just goodness after goodness, blessing after blessing. And one of them, I'm 9 years old, in a wheelchair at the kitchen table, unable to do anything. I can't stand, I can't move, can't go back to school. I'll never write again. I'll never hold a girl's hand. I'll never get a job. Although I survived and went home, this is no life. And I'm not articulate enough to communicate that and not bold enough to tell my parents that's how I feel. But I think frequently great leaders can cut through the bowl and I acknowledge what's really happening below the surface.
Yes.
So, you know, I'm smiling all the time and I'm acting like everything's great. But the reality is, man, I was struggling. I was a victim to my circumstances. And my mother, who is a phenomenal leader, ordinary and extraordinary, she sees this thing. She makes a phone call to Mrs. Bartello. And one of the things I remember most about that first meeting is the piano teacher walks into our house. You know, man, I hated piano before I got burned. And now I realize I'll never at least have to see Miss Bartello again. And she starts walking toward me. So I look up at my mom and I'm on morphine. So I say, Mama, what is she doing here? And during 2021, I'm going to give you a sentence you may want to write down when you bump into someone you disagree with politically or racially or on virtues and values, or your neighbor doesn't take care of his yard the way you expect, or your child's wearing the wrong kind of pants, or whatever the thing is, you may want to write down a really important sentence. This one's good. This one will play. So I look up at my mom and I say, Mama, what is she doing here? And here's word for word what my mother says in response. Please write it down, listeners. All right. Now put a period behind it and then put it in little quotes. During a season in our existence when it is so common to quickly tweet back and to cancel out and to fight back and to elevate your voice, man. Get the megaphone if you need it. Curse them out. what she did is the more proper next best step, and it is to not speak. Why would you talk with someone who won't even listen? Instead, my mother has the audacity to take humble, bold, faithful, audacious, purposeful movement, action. She bends down, she unhooks the brakes in the wheelchair. She rolls me away from the pity party. I look up and I say, Mama, where are you taking me? She doesn't talk. Why waste your breath? She just moves. And movement is highly underrated, people. It's a great way to get unstuck. Move, go, do something, please. My mother moves me away from the kitchen table. Against my will, I will add, takes me down a hallway, locks the brakes, puts the piano teacher walks in. She puts her arm around me. This is a great line for 2021. Miss Bartello puts her arm around me. She looks me in the eyes and she goes, John, this is going to be really hard. And then she adds, but we can do it together. It's a word for word quote from Miss Bartello back from 1987 at a piano class for a kid with no fingers. John, this is going to be really hard, but we can do it together. And I think as we continually move through a pandemic and whatever struggles you're dealing with personally, we need to be reminded of that. If you're trying to do this thing by yourself, and most of us are, according to Pew, 64% of us feel like we're doing life completely by ourselves. Well, we can't, but together we can. So this is not just trite language from a politician over here, someone else over there, a motivational speaker. This is critical content that we got to unpack every single day of our lives to accept and also to become. This lady then takes her arm off of my shoulder. She puts a number 2 pencil on my right bandaged hand. She takes out 3 rubber bands, ties it onto my hand. There are no fingers. There is no skin exposed. She just ties it onto my bandaged up hand. And then she looks at me and goes, now, where were we? Like as if nothing's happened, man. Like, now, where were we? And she pulls out the sheet music, and there's this little kid who doesn't want to be there with a pencil sticking out of his bandaged hands on the rubber bands, playing the piano. And the entire time, Brian, thinking, oh my gosh, like I hate my mom. I cannot believe she's making me do this. And then when that lady came back the following week, I was stunned. And then she came back the following week and I was even more stunned. And she just kept coming back, like you said, for 5 years. And now if you ever visit me in my home, you'll find a guy who's got a piano, man, and makes his own kids take piano class. And they resent him for that. But I love the piano now. I've learned how to play it. I've learned how to not worry so much about hitting the wrong keys. We could have another hour podcast there, but I think so often the reason why we don't make the call, don't ask her out, don't say, I'm sorry, don't say, how can I do better, is because we're just, what if I hit the wrong key? What if I screw it up, man? I don't want to. I think you're doing a far worse job by not trying. And so my mom and that piano teacher taught me the power of trying and what a gift that is. And they allowed a little boy who saw no real possibility for his life to look just over the horizon where no one else was looking and to imagine what remained possible. And that is an incredible gift to have vision. Right now, one of the things they say we as a nation are missing out on, and it has led to anxiety, way elevation, despair. Last year, 1.6 million attempted suicides in our nation. The pandemic was here long before COVID. Lack of hope. How do you re-spark hope? It's to have a bit of a vision for a life that's even better tomorrow than the one you're living today. It's something that will animate you and get you out of that rut and allow you to dream and work and pray and network and imagine that great things remain possible at any age, regardless of where you've been through and regardless of where you are.
So many great nuggets in there, John. And I love that. This is going to be hard, but we can do this together. What awesome. A motto, right, for 2021. I can't thank you enough. You know, you're a dear friend. I love watching you and your career and what you've done and the millions and millions of people you continuously inspire and the good nuggets that you have. And, you know, I'm very grateful for our friendship and for the opportunity to have you on our podcast. So thank you so much, John. Have an awesome rest of your week. And I really appreciate everything you've done for us.
Hey, Brian, welcome to the podcast world. You've got nowhere to go but up, man. So you started with a very ordinary dude, and now you're going to rise from here. So congratulations on that. And then I just think it's really important as people at home or in your car or working out or whatever you're doing right now. It's so common to hear Brian and you know the success that he is, or to hear John and you hear this crazy story to think, dang, man, like these guys, or Jack Buck. And we just, in listening to someone else's story, are at risk of thinking that they are extraordinary rather than recognizing how ordinary people do extraordinary things. That's the call. And so if you don't mind, give me like 11 seconds to wrap up. Jack Buck, the great announcer for the St. Louis Cardinals, heard about John O'Leary and took action into his life because my next door neighbor, who was a widow, her name was Carol Bauer, called a friend whose name I don't know, who called a friend whose name I don't know, who called another very ordinary person whose name I don't know, who called a woman named Colleen. So we're 5 deep into ordinary people, who called a guy named Red, her dad. Red Shandings was a former manager for the Cardinals and a player before that, who went to a charity auction that night and sat next to a guy named Jack Buck. And so when ordinary people continually take the next best step forward with purposeful movement, it is always how we've changed the world. So I don't know which character you are in that little telephone line, if you're the neighbor or you're the boy who burned himself up, or you're the announcer, or you're the Hall of Fame second baseman, Red Shandings, or the daughter, like pick the person. But we fit in somewhere. We fit into this puzzle, and together we can solve this puzzle, and we can ensure that in spite of the headwind, our best days do indeed remain in front of us. So just be bold, keep moving forward, and recognize that it is not easy, but it is the calling to keep stepping forward.
Appreciate you, brother. Love you very much. And we will catch up soon. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Brian. Tell the kids hi.
I will. Likewise. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, man.